Hello, good morning. The 9th plenary meeting of the 11th emergency special session of the General Assembly is called to order. Before proceeding further, I would like to remind members that due to the temporary closure of the east side emergency doors, in the event of a fire or an emergency which requires an evacuation, please use the west side emergency doors and the stairways next to the elevator banks. Those in the 3rd and 4th balconies, please use the stairway next to the elevator's bank. The Assembly will now continue its consideration of the agenda item 5 entitled Letter dated 28 February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, S/2014/136. To hear from the remaining speakers on the list of speakers carried over from our 8th plenary meeting yesterday. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of San Marino.
Mr. President, the Republic of San Marino aligns itself with the statement delivered yesterday by the European Union, and I will now add some remarks in my national capacity. The Republic of San Marino condemns the Russian aggression against Ukraine and is deeply worried for the ongoing conflict as well as for the subsequent humanitarian crisis. San Marino has co-sponsored the draft resolution entitled Humanitarian Consequences of the Aggression against Ukraine. Mr. President, the ongoing military offensive, which has regrettably been escalating, has already caused more than 2,000 civilian casualties, including women and children. The suffering of civilians is growing hour by hour. According to the OCHA data, the number of internally displaced persons combined with those who have fled to other countries amounts to more than 10 million people, nearly a quarter of the population of Ukraine, and the number is still increasing. San Marino strongly condemns the indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks on civilians, including the indiscriminate shelling, airstrikes, and use of explosive devices in densely populated areas. International humanitarian law is clear. Civilians and civilian objects must be protected. The Republic of San Marino calls on the parties to respect the principles of international humanitarian law and deeply condemns the attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructures, including hospitals and schools. We reiterate that the use of explosive weapons in populated areas has a devastating and indiscriminate impact on civilians, putting children particularly at risk. Mr. President, with the ongoing hostilities, many people remain trapped in areas of escalating conflict, and with essential services disrupted, they are unable to meet even their most basic needs. Civilians have been enduring terrible conditions, living underground without water, food, heat, electricity, and medicine for weeks. We stress the importance of protecting humanitarian corridors for a safe passage of civilians fleeing their homes in search of safety and security. We also ask for the protection of humanitarian actors who are risking their lives to deliver their assistance and essential services to the population, in particular to the most vulnerable people, such as women and girls, the elderly, the disabled, and the people with serious medical conditions. We are particularly worried for the situation of those vulnerable groups. Women and girls need our immediate attention, being particularly at risk of becoming victims of violence and exploitation in these circumstances. Mr. President, the Republic of San Marino stands in deep solidarity with the people of Ukraine and asks all parties involved in the hostilities to put humanitarian imperative first. The Republic of San Marino stands ready to give its contribution to this humanitarian emergency and to address this unprecedented level of displacement. From the beginning of the conflict, San Marino has welcomed almost 300 refugees from Ukraine, and the government together with civil society, private entities and sport federations, is working to facilitate the integration and inclusion of these refugees, mostly women and children, in the territory. The government has created a subsidy that San Marino families hosting Ukrainian refugees can access to support basic expenses. Also, a fundraising has been activated with the aim to partially finance the activities necessary to allow a sustainable stay in our territory. The fund has already received generous contributions from the citizens of San Marino and from public and private entities. The citizens of San Marino have also contributed to the collection of medical equipment to be donated to Ukraine. The Republic of San Marino feels the tragedy that people living under attack have to endure. We hear the intolerable and constant noise of war. We see the destruction of buildings, houses, and entire cities. All this has to stop. San Marino continues to call for an immediate cessation of hostilities. We don't and we never accept the use of arms to settle disputes that must find their resolution in international law, in the principles of the United Nations Charter, and in political mediation. Only through political dialogue will we find a durable and peaceful solution to this crisis, a crisis that is a deep wound for all peoples and nations who strongly believe in the values of peace. We encourage all parties to recommit to diplomatic negotiations. That is the only way to stop this tragedy and the only way forward. Thank you.
Thank you to the distinguished representative of San Marino. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cambodia.
Thank you, Mr. President. On behalf of the royal government of Cambodia, I would like to express my sincere condolences to the people and the government of the United States for the passing away of former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, and may her soul rest in peace. Cambodia expressed its grave concern on the intensifying gravity of the situation and worsening of humanitarian conditions resulting from the ongoing military hostility in Ukraine, including civilian casualty, displaced persons, and the growing flow of refugees to its neighboring countries. The draft resolution in document A/ES11/L2 that is being considered by the General Assembly timely calls upon Member States and international community to address humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. During this dire situation, it is absolutely important that all parties must ensure safe and full access for humanitarian relief to people in need in and around Ukraine. Attacks must not be targeted against civilian and civilian infrastructure. All parties must respect the international humanitarian laws and human rights law. In their statement on Ukraine, issued on 3rd March 2022, the ASEAN Foreign Minister called for a ceasefire or armistice and continuation of political dialogues which would lead to sustainable peace in Ukraine. The ASEAN Foreign Minister underlined the importance of a ceasefire to create an enabling environment for negotiation to address the current crisis and avoid expanding suffering of innocent people. As a friendly nation of both countries, Cambodia encouraged Russia and Ukraine to resolve their conflicts through diplomacy and dialogue and other peaceful means in order to end the humanitarian crisis and to achieve a long-lasting peace between the two nations. Cambodia has co-sponsored the draft resolution and will vote in favor of it. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cambodia. And I will now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Côte d'Ivoire.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I wish to begin by presenting the sincere condolences of my delegation to the people and the government of the United States on the passing of Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State and Ambassador of the United States to the United Nations. My delegation would also like to welcome the resumption of the 11th Emergency Special Session on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, and we hail the tireless efforts of the Secretary-General to find a peaceful and lasting settlement to the crisis in that country. Mr. President, Côte d'Ivoire wishes to restate its commitment to the respect for the integrity, sovereignty and independence of states, as well as to the peaceful settlement of disputes, as enshrined in the United Nations Charter. It is therefore an imperative that we respect the values that we have freely subscribed to in regulating our life in common. That is why my country is so concerned at the escalation of violence, which unfortunately continues to cause danger and has brought massive destruction and a terrible number of casualties. This makes it all the more urgent that we apply the resolution of the 2nd of March 2022 that we voted on so democratically. Indeed, according to the recent figures communicated by the UNHCR and the International Organization for Migration, more than 10 million people have been forced to leave their homes in a quest for safety and security, and 3.5 million of them are refugees in neighbouring countries. My country resolutely condemns the violations of international humanitarian law, as well as the violations of human rights perpetrated in Ukraine. We call for the strict respect of international humanitarian law, as well as respect for the relevant legal provisions that govern them, in particular the Geneva Convention of 1949 and the additional protocol. Côte d'Ivoire also calls for the security and safety of civilians during these military operations and for respect for the principle of distinction, proportionality and precaution as is called for by international humanitarian law. We furthermore call for civilians to be protected as they flee the violence while facilitating the safe and unimpeded access of humanitarian aid to those who need it in Ukraine and in neighbouring countries. My delegation wishes to reiterate its call for fair and non-discriminatory treatment of all the people who are affected by this crisis, including Africans and people of African descent. Mr. President, my country is glad to see the mobilization and solidarity of the international community to help the people who are affected by this conflict. We echo the call for emergency financing for a robust humanitarian response in Ukraine, as well as intervention in favour of refugees in Ukraine and neighbouring countries. Finally, Côte d'Ivoire calls for the immediate cessation of hostilities to give a chance for dialogue and diplomacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'll now give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. President, the current development in Ukraine has caused widespread concern in the international community and is something that China does not wish to see. On the issue of Ukraine, it is China's consistent position that the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be upheld. Legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously. and all efforts conducive to peaceful resolution of the crisis should be supported. At present, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine is becoming increasingly serious, and the civilian casualties and massive displacement caused by the conflict are profoundly regrettable. The most urgent task now is to urge the parties to exercise maximum restraint, avoid more civilian casualties, and reach a ceasefire through negotiations as soon as possible, especially to prevent a greater humanitarian crisis. China attaches great importance to the humanitarian issue in Ukraine, has put forward a 6-point initiative in this regard, and has already delivered several shipments of humanitarian aid to the Ukraine Red Cross. We welcome any initiative or measures that can help alleviate or resolve the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. China's fundamental starting point is to urge the international community and the UN to attach great importance to the humanitarian situation in Ukraine and call on the parties concerned to strengthen coordination on humanitarian issues, to effectively protect the safety of civilians, in particular vulnerable groups such as women and children, and to facilitate the evacuation of people and humanitarian relief operations. We likewise support the UN and the relevant agencies in actively carrying out relief operations. In view of the current situation, when dealing with the humanitarian issue in Ukraine, the principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality established by G Resolution 46/182 should be strictly observed, and the politicization of humanitarian issues be prevented. China agrees with the purpose of the draft resolution on the humanitarian issue in Ukraine proposed by France, Mexico, and other countries, and appreciates the efforts made by France, Mexico, and other countries concerned to promote consensus. At the same time, it's clear that some of the contents of the draft resolution go beyond the scope of humanity, and some issues are very complex, can only be resolved through political negotiations between the parties concerned. The draft resolution proposed by South Africa focuses on humanitarian issues and addresses many important aspects of the current situation in Ukraine, while emphasizing that the cessation of hostilities is a crucial step towards improving the humanitarian situation. We believe that under the current complex circumstances, the South African draft resolution is more conducive to promoting the unity of UN member states and to further opening the door to dialogue and negotiation and a political solution. China has therefore joined in co-sponsoring the South African draft resolution. Mr. President, today's world is faced with many serious challenges. The spillover effect of the Ukraine crisis have further global repercussions. The world has not yet emerged from the shadow of COVID-19. And the ever-expanding implementation of sweeping, non-discriminatory sanctions has buffeted and will further buffet global economy, trade, finance, energy, food, and industrial and supply chains, seriously affecting the normal lives of people in all countries, and exacerbating the already difficult world economy. Developing countries, the majority of the world, are not parties to this conflict. They should not be drawn into this tension or forced to suffer the consequences of geopolitical conflicts and major power games. The use of force and sanctions cannot be the only two options for dealing with international and regional hotspot issues. In the face of complex situations, all countries have the right to decide independently and autonomously on their foreign policies. The countries concerned should not adopt the simplistic approach of either friend or foe, black or white, or force any country to choose a side. Respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all countries is a basic norm of international relations that applies to all countries in all situations, and there should be no exceptions in this regard. Still less double standards. Mr. President, dialogue and negotiation are the only way out of the crisis in Ukraine, China strongly appeals to the international community to exercise reason, strengthen solidarity, and make unremitting efforts to achieve a ceasefire and peace. And China will continue to play a constructive role in facilitating peace talks. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Pakistan.
Mr. President, the Pakistan delegation joins in expressing its condolences to the people and government of the United States on the sad demise of Secretary Madeleine Albright. She was an outstanding diplomat who contributed to multilateralism, to the post-Cold War order, and to the advancement of the rights of women. Mr. President, yesterday, the 48th session of the Council of Foreign Ministers of the Organization of Islamic Conference, the OIC, issued the Islamabad Declaration. In this declaration, the OIC foreign ministers stated the following with regard to the situation in Ukraine, and I quote, "We express deep concern at the deteriorating security and humanitarian situation arising from the conflict in Ukraine. We reaffirm unequivocal support for the universal and consistent application of the principles of the UN Charter, including non-use of force, respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, non-interference in their internal affairs, and pacific settlement of disputes, to preserve and build international peace and security, to ensure equal security for all states, and respect for international humanitarian law." Having deliberated on the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine at the 48th session of the Council of Foreign Ministers, we call for an immediate cessation of hostilities to prevent further loss of life and ensure that the humanitarian crisis does not worsen in Ukraine. We stress the need for the establishment of humanitarian corridors to ensure safe movement of civilians from active conflict zones and the provision of humanitarian supplies. We urge both sides to engage in meaningful dialogue with the purpose of finding a solution to the present conflict. We express the willingness of OIC member states to support and facilitate the dialogue process between all sides, if requested. End of quotation. Mr. President, Pakistan appreciates the several efforts made by some countries to facilitate an end to this war and promote a negotiated solution. These include Turkey and China. Pakistan has supported such efforts and contributed to them within our capacity. Mr. President, we also appreciate the endeavors at the United Nations by South Africa, the European Union, Mexico, and others to agree on a resolution to provide adequate and expeditious humanitarian assistance to those so gravely affected by the Ukraine conflict. Even at this late stage in our deliberations, we hope that we can adopt an agreed outcome which can facilitate the promotion of humanitarian help to civilians in Ukraine, to the refugees and displaced people, including foreign nationals and students, on the basis of humanitarian principles and without discrimination. Mr. President, such an agreed outcome should not be impeded by political considerations. A divided outcome in this Assembly will not yield the humanitarian objectives we all desire. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Myanmar.
President. The delegation of Myanmar wishes to express our deepest condolences to the people and government of the United States on the passing of Madam Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State and USPR to UN. May she rest in peace. Mr. President, I thank you, Mr. President, for convening of this meeting. Myanmar co-sponsored the draft resolution L2 entitled Humanitarian Consequences of Aggressions Against Ukraine, introduced by the country concerned, Ukraine, and will vote yes. We always value the first and foremost the position of the country concerned and respect the voices of the people of the country concerned. As the people of Ukraine continue to face catastrophic situations caused by the aggressions and indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, humanitarian assistance to the people in need must be provided at the forefront and in a timely manner. All unnecessary sufferings of the people, including women and children, elderly, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups must end completely and immediately. It is vital that civilians, including humanitarian personnel, medical personnel, journalists, and persons in vulnerable situations, including women and children, must be fully protected. We welcome the continued efforts of the UN member states, the UN Secretary General, UN agencies, and international organizations to deliver humanitarian assistance as well as assistance and protection for refugees. We also welcome the appointment by the UN Secretary General of a United Nations Crisis Coordinator for Ukraine. Mr. President, we fully share the sufferings of the people of Ukraine. We stand firm and in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. The people of Myanmar are experiencing similar man-made tragedies and humanitarian crises resulted from the military's atrocities, crimes against humanity, indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks against its own people. According to the UN, to this date, there are almost 900,000 people remain displaced and 6.2 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance due to the military's indiscriminate attacks across the country. At the same time, our people are encountering the issue of food insecurity. As such, Myanmar would like to reiterate our appeal for immediate and complete cessation of hostility and attacks on Ukraine, while calling for ensuring humanitarian access and providing humanitarian assistance to the people in and around Ukraine. We also urge the international community to provide humanitarian assistance to the people in need in Myanmar in a transparent and inclusive manner to help the people of Myanmar in our efforts for ending these military atrocities and the military dictatorship in a timely and effective manner. Saving lives is a noble task for everyone. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of Canada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I appreciate the opportunity to address the Chamber today. Like many others, I'd like to express the deep condolences of the Government of Canada, of our delegation, and many of us personally for the loss of Madeleine Albright. She was truly an outstanding public servant. She was a great leader for the United States. She was a great friend of Canada, and indeed of our foreign minister who was with her when she was Secretary of State, and we shall miss her presence on the world stage. It's a loss for all of us. This is now a defining time for the United Nations. The Russian Federation is continuing its illegal invasion of Ukraine, an unprovoked act of aggression against its neighbor. Russia has, to this point, expressed no repentance and has carried on unabated since we last met to condemn its actions as a serious violation of the United Nations Charter. In the last few days, the International Court of Justice has also ordered that Russia immediately suspend its military operation in Ukraine. And yet, Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, a creator of the Nuremberg process, signatory to the creation of the International Court of Justice and to the Geneva Conventions, carries on as if there is no law and there are no rules above them. We know now how serious the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, in fact, is. Scores of innocent civilians, including children, have been killed and injured. And this situation is not getting better, it's getting worse by the hour. We are witnessing before our very eyes the premeditated destruction of entire cities. What is happening in Mariupol right now tells you everything you need to know about this particularly cruel war of aggression. Russia is laying siege to this city and to others, to its people, bombing hospitals, bombing schools, flattening entire apartment complexes. Expected mothers, children, and the medical staff at the Children's Hospital and Maternity Ward were slaughtered in a particularly gruesome attack on the 9th of March. This is part of a horrific trend. In just 25 days, the United Nations has verified 52 attacks against healthcare centers in Ukraine. Medical personnel and facilities are supposed to be protected under international humanitarian law. These attacks and all attacks against civilians and against civilian areas must stop. There is no justification for these attacks, and there's nothing special about Russia's military operation in Ukraine. It is directed at whole cities, at people's homes. But we also have to remember that, as with any armed conflict, it immediately gives rise to obligations for all parties under international humanitarian law. These laws are designed to protect civilians, to limit suffering, and ensure that those in need of aid receive it. These obligations cannot be willed or bargained away. They apply to Russia, and they apply to Ukraine, and they must be observed. The resolution before us, the humanitarian consequences of the aggression against Ukraine, Canada has been proud to join in co-sponsoring with more than 80 countries. We affirm this by demanding full compliance with international humanitarian law and for desperately needed humanitarian access. If this resolution is passed, there will be no delay in the provision of humanitarian assistance, and there will be no division about the provision of humanitarian assistance. More than 10 million Ukrainians have been forced to flee their homes. 10 million. Think about that number for a minute. 10 million in 4 weeks. That is more people forcibly displaced by Russia's military in Ukraine than the entire population of more than 100 states that are represented in this assembly. 10 million people in 4 weeks displaced. Of those, 3 million are refugees plus have fled Ukraine since the start of this war. This is creating enormous strain on neighboring countries, and that's not an accident either. And adding unnecessarily to the already record numbers of refugees and displaced persons globally who have fled from Afghanistan, from Venezuela, the Sahel region, Syria, Myanmar, and so many other conflicts. While we are focused today on Ukraine, we cannot neglect these and other situations. Humanitarian needs everywhere deserve just as much care and attention. Canada will continue to respond to those needs, just as we respond to the catastrophe that is unfolding in Ukraine. Mr. President, it's important to remember that the impacts of this war of aggression by Russia on Ukraine are, of course, devastating Ukraine. That's what they're intended to do. That's what Russia has set out to do, to destroy and undermine the economy, the structure, the people, the cities, and the humanity of Ukraine. But they're also felt outside the region, as many people have said, in the least developed countries and by vulnerable populations around the world. Rising energy prices, supply chain disruptions, impacts on food security, food shortages leading to higher prices, to hardships, to instability, to malnutrition, to starvation, and yes, to famine. These impacts of Russia's war of choice, and that's what it is. This is a war that has created all of these impacts and had all of these effects. They threaten such hard-won progress on development that we've made over the last decade, distract the world from its recovery from the COVID impact, and undermine efforts to combat climate change and to achieve the SDGs. Monsieur le Président.
But, Mr. President, let us be clear. All these impacts and crises, as serious as they are, can drop dramatically tomorrow if Russia puts an end to its war of aggression. Russia must put an end to this war before further damage is caused. The General Assembly, in its first resolution of this emergency special session, deplored Russia's actions as a violation of the Charter of the United Nations, of its objectives and its principle. Russia's war is not just against Ukraine. We must remember that Ukraine is not the only victim of this war. The war goes against the principles and the commitments that we collectively took by signing the Charter of the United Nations. Thus, it is a war against peace, progress, the freedom of nations and of peoples to choose their own destiny. We are the United Nations. We are not the empires at war. Mr. President, dear colleagues, this is a war that President Putin cannot win. Once again, I stress this. Putin cannot win this war. Russia has prevented the Security Council from doing its fundamental duty of protecting the world's peace and security. Russia also prevented the Council by threatening a veto from adopting a humanitarian resolution. Once again, it is up to us now, up to the General Assembly, to defend the international rules-based order within which the United Nations and its charter play a central role. We have before us today a resolution which we believe deserves the support of all countries. Canada calls on you to vote for it. We have carefully listened at this Assembly and during our conversations to the concerns that all member states expressed.
To address concerns about impacts on the least developed countries, about the discrimination against any refugee fleeing Ukraine, about the safety of foreign students, about food security, and the need to fully fund the UN's Global Humanitarian Response Plan. The resolution that has been tabled does just that, in addition to demanding the protection of civilians and safe and unhindered humanitarian access. There's been a suggestion, and we've heard it again today, that a humanitarian resolution should not say anything about the cause of the crisis or ascribe responsibility to any party. With great respect, Mr. President, we disagree. This is not a natural disaster. A humanitarian crisis of this type is not a spontaneous event. It didn't just happen. It happened because one country attacked deliberately, without provocation, another country. It is the direct result of a deliberate decision by the Russian Federation to invade Ukraine. To put it in simplest terms, we cannot talk about Moby Dick without mentioning that it's a whale. We can't do it. We can't pretend it didn't happen. We can't just set it aside and say that's of no importance. If we do not identify the aggressor and do not insist that it uphold its obligation to fully respect international law and comply with the legally binding order of the International Court of Justice, then I would argue we have failed to do our job. A ceasefire and a withdrawal of occupying troops is necessary to take the next steps.
The Swiss founder of the International Red Cross, Henri Dunant, was so stricken by the human devastation on the battlefield in Solferino that he began his exemplary work leading to the fundamental principles of humanitarian aid and the obligations of all during wartime. It is said that his last words on his deathbed were the question, "Where is humanity?" Today we must answer, we are here.
We are going to be voting yes today on this resolution for this reason, for humanity. We vote yes for humanity, not in the name of being able to solve all the problems of the world, because we cannot do that, but rather because we have to take the footsteps to peace, truth, justice, and reconciliation. And yes, sometimes we have to say difficult things, and we cannot avoid the facts and the reality of this situation. The Canadian poet Leonard Cohen put it this way: there are no perfect offerings. There's a crack. There's a crack in everything. But that's where the light gets in. Let us keep our eyes on the light, and let us face the time ahead in love and solidarity with one another. Despite our differences, we will get there. But we do it with honesty and with courage and with solidarity. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of Austria.
Mr. President, and thanks, Bob. I think Bob Ray is the best warm-up support act you can get here at the UN at the moment. You rule, Bob. Before I begin, let me express Austria's heartfelt condolences and sympathies to Linda and to the US colleagues on the passing of Secretary Madeleine Albright. She was a strong advocate for multilateral diplomacy and a role model for us here at the UN and for the world. Let me assure you that Austria also aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. Colleagues, today we meet for a second time here in the GA to discuss the unprovoked, illegal and unjustified act of aggression of Russia against Ukraine. Today we do so to discuss the devastating humanitarian consequences of the aggression. Thanks to UN reports, OCHA reports and briefings, we have a clear picture of the terrible humanitarian situation. People suffer unimaginable horrors in cities like Mariupol, Kharkiv, Kherson. Bob mentioned many. Children suffer, as do the old, the sick, the disabled, those in healthcare centers, in institutions, in orphanages. We hear reports about attacks on civilian infrastructure with explosive weapons and about the use of cluster munitions in populated areas. We hear about shellings of healthcare facilities and schools, about hunger, about lack of medicine. We hear about acts that constitute war crimes that must be condemned in the strongest terms by all of us. International humanitarian law is not optional. We insist on its strict implementation by all of us. I have not heard a single voice here who argued that the suffering in Ukraine is necessary or justified. Dear colleagues, while the humanitarian conditions in Mariupol, Kharkiv, and Kherson seem outside the scope of the imaginable for many, unfortunately, they are all too familiar. In parts of the Middle East, the Gulf or Africa, civilians suffer. In many instances, the Security Council has taken action. Even in politically difficult cases, the Council found a compromise. Not so regarding Ukraine. Here, the Security Council has been unable to act, failing its role as guardian of peace and security under the UN Charter. Clearly, when we start discussing the proposal on the new agenda for peace in our common agenda, this predicament must be addressed. But until then, it's up to us here in the General Assembly, to address the situation in Ukraine. And in view of the tragedy on the ground, this should be quite straightforward. We need an immediate ceasefire. The Russian attacks must stop. We need safe and secure evacuation of civilians, including through humanitarian corridors or safe passages. And we need access for humanitarian personnel and aid. All of these points are reflected in the resolution that we will adopt shortly, which Austria will support, and hopefully most of you as well. There is a second resolution that has been put forward. This is the right of every state, and there's a lot in that second resolution that Austria also supports, but there are glaring omissions. And we already have a resolution presented by Ukraine that covers all relevant points. Moreover, it is unusual that this second draft was not consulted with the country that the resolution deals with. I hope that the sponsors of that resolution do not put the draft forward for action before ensuring that it meets the approval of the country concerned. This is, after all, a humanitarian resolution. We are uniting here to support the suffering people of Ukraine and not to antagonize it. Colleagues, we heard about some of the consequences of the war of aggression against Ukraine. There are many concerns. As the world's breadbasket, the war in Ukraine threatens food security, particularly in vulnerable countries, including the LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS. And there are very real concerns regarding consequences of a potential nuclear fallout caused by an attack on the nuclear facility. All international norms in the field of nuclear security must be fully respected, and we support all efforts, in particular those of the IAEA and Director General Grossi, to ensure nuclear safety around Ukraine's nuclear facilities. And we must make best use of the upcoming conference on the physical protection of nuclear material that we have worked hard to strengthen. Yes, we must all do our part to help. We've heard of many humanitarian efforts and initiatives by the UN, by member states, and we commend those. Austria allocated over 17 million euros to support UNHCR, UNICEF, ICRC, NGOs, and we deployed a crisis team to Moldova to provide additional consular support and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine's immediate neighbors. Colleagues, when we think about what we can do, let's also be frank and factual here in this assembly. Like Bob, I'm puzzled when I hear colleagues arguing that we should avoid politicization, that we need to balance the text, that we need more neutral language. This is a humanitarian resolution, for goodness sake. This is about the suffering of people because of armed attacks and war crimes. How can that require balance and neutral language? Should we seek equidistance between victim and aggressor? Austria is a neutral state. We're not party to any military alliance. Our neutrality is embedded in our constitution. Believe me, we know about neutrality. Neutrality does not mean neutrality of values, nor does it mean taking no position when faced with unprovoked, unjustified violations of international law. Like other neutral states, we take a clear stance. We speak up against violations of the law and humanitarian law, against violations of our UN Charter. We support efforts to hold those responsible for crimes. And we support clear language in our humanitarian resolution, in Ukraine's resolution, clear language that differentiates between victim and aggressor. Austria, therefore, urges you to vote in favor of this humanitarian resolution to show the world once again that the United Nations General Assembly continues to protect civilians, to defend the rule of law, and to uphold the UN Charter. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of this Sovereign Order of Malta.
Mr. President, Secretary General, distinguished representatives, the Sovereign Order of Malta conveys its condolences to our colleagues at the U.S. mission to the United Nations on the loss of former Ambassador and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. As a refugee herself, it is salient that her memory is invoked here and at this moment. Condolences also to our colleagues at the Republic of Ireland's mission to the United Nations on the passing of Ambassador Jim Kelly. Our national symbol is an 8-pointed cross representing the Beatitudes. One in particular is apposite in remembering these two distinguished diplomats and public servants. Blessed are the peacemakers. Sharing in its humanitarian spirit and mindful of the pain and anguish of the Ukrainian people, the Sovereign Order of Malta, as a permanent observer, and therefore not casting a vote today, does, however, express its support for the humanitarian focus of a draft resolution that is under consideration today. Mr. President, the Sovereign Order of Malta condemns any form of unwarranted aggression against sovereign states and is deeply concerned by the suffering of the people of the Ukraine, the suffering of civilians, especially women and children, the suffering of the sick, and the unbearable suffering of the elderly. We reiterate our call for a cessation of hostilities against the innocent and for a strengthened purpose through dialogue to find a pathway to peace. The current fighting in Ukraine has caused the death of countless innocent civilians, destroyed civic infrastructure, ripped apart families, has forced nearly 4 million people to flee the country, while causing the internal displacement of up to 6 million individuals. We, an independent, neutral, sovereign entity state, providing global humanitarian aid in over 120 countries, we have provided considerable support, advice, and material help to the Ukrainian people, particularly during these 8 years of conflict. At this moment, our staff are currently serving in Ukraine and in neighboring countries, totaling over 5,000 personnel with tens of thousands of volunteers, doing everything from serving hot food and drink, caring for victims of injury and accident, providing first aid, medical assistance, counselling, emotional support, and securing short and long-term accommodations. Volunteers from locations away from the border, many of them from other countries, representing faith-based and community groups, have travelled to the region with supplies and humanitarian equipment, in some cases putting their own lives in danger. Our crisis response arm, Malteser International, and our national associations and relief corps are coordinating activities with regional and local government agencies, particularly within Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, the Czech Republic, Lithuania, Germany, and Austria, and with international aid organizations such as the Red Cross, the Order of St. John, and the Johanniter Orden, the UN agencies such as the UN High Commission for Refugees. We are also engaged in an international fundraising program to ensure that adequate resources continue to be available. However, the dire humanitarian situation inside Ukraine continues to deteriorate rapidly as densely populated areas such as the city of Mariupol are shelled incessantly with scenes of devastation reminiscent of World War II, and impacted civilian populations, from women and children to journalists, together with humanitarian and medical personnel. They all deserve the right to safety, along with secure, voluntary and unhindered passage. Those who have been able to escape the escalating violence in their homeland tell our volunteers on the ground that all they want is to go home in peace and security and resume their lives, send their children back to school, care for their aging relatives, their pets, and sit and breathe the air of freedom and peace. Yet still millions more await inside Ukraine in an atmosphere of uncertainty, even terror. These are the rural populations, the workers, the farmers, the agriculturalists, those whose efforts in wheat production in better times help feed millions of the world starving. Now they face the prospect of starving too, and they need our help, while the UN World Food Programme and millions across Africa and in other nations of the world desperately wait for a solution that will provide life-giving sustenance to the hungry. Mr. President, refugees and IDPs are especially vulnerable, and the Order of Malta expresses serious concerns at the heightened risk of sexual violence, especially trafficking in persons, which has already been observed from border locations, reported by numerous NGOs, the media, local police officials. To reduce the risk of human trafficking, effective assistance, protection, and clear advisories must be provided to refugees without discrimination. Adequate training needs to be provided to those providing advice and assistance, that these vulnerable women, children, and youth will not fall victim to this scourge. We appeal to all people of goodwill to assist in the protection of all refugees, IDPs, and persons in need, inside and outside of Ukraine. And we ask the UN community for compassion on behalf of the innocent. Distinguished delegates, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And with this, we have heard the last speaker on this item. Before we proceed to take a decision on draft resolutions A/ES11L2 and A/ES11L3, delegation wishing to make a statement in explanation of votes before the vote on any or both of these draft resolutions are invited to do so now in one intervention. Before giving the floor for explanation of votes, I would like to remind delegations that explanation of votes are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. South Africa is deeply concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and its neighboring countries. It is vital that the United Nations General Assembly adopts a resolution responding to this humanitarian crisis and affirm the international humanitarian principles that the parties must abide by. Addressing the human situation should be our immediate priority. Unfortunately, instead of placing the humanitarian crisis and our response at the center of our deliberations, the political divisions in this assembly suggest that perhaps in the minds of some delegations, the humanitarian response is secondary to geopolitical objectives. While we should not ignore the context that gave rise to this crisis, and nor should we ignore any violations of the UN Charter and international law, that should not divert us, our focus, from what we ought to be immediately doing. Mr. President, what we should be doing as a matter of urgency is working as a global community to end the war by calling for a cessation of hostilities, as this is the first step in a comprehensive humanitarian response. This will create the necessary environment required for a political process that will lead to sustainable peace. Let us be clear, war has no winners. The real heroes are those that work towards peace. Through the last few decades, the world has continued to experience debilitating conflicts. Many of these wars have contravened the provisions of the Charter and international law. In one of these conflicts, the devastating war in Iraq, for example, over 2.4 million people are reported to have died since 2003. Many more civilians across the world have died and been displaced. Making this point today in our discussion on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine is not a form of whataboutery. It is underscoring the point that many countries and their peoples suffer the consequences of wars that are not of their own doing. They have had no role to play in starting or ending those wars. In fact, we must make the point that in most cases, the vast majority of countries in this assembly have never invaded or colonized other countries, yet have suffered their consequences. There are few powerful countries that have been party to most of these conflicts, often in the form of proxy wars in other countries or regions. Africa has experienced its fair share of these proxy wars and their destructive outcomes. We therefore empathize with the people of Ukraine who find themselves caught up in a conflict not of their making. War and the use of force is never a solution to international disputes, irrespective of which countries are involved. Once war has begun, it is imperative that all of us work towards peace. It is for this reason that South Africa is of the view that right now we should be more concerned with ending the war and addressing the humanitarian plight of the people that are impacted by it. Mr. President, South Africa remains steadfast that an atmosphere of dialogue, mediation, and diplomacy is the only path to de-escalate the current conflict. In this regard, we reiterate our call for the good offices of the United Nations to mediate in pursuit of finding a sustainable solution, and for us as member states to facilitate an enabling environment for dialogue. Mr. President, in the backdrop of the deepening humanitarian crisis and the pursuit of peace not in sight, we ought to ask ourselves what matters the most. Our objective at this assembly must be to find a constructive outcome conducive to the creation of sustainable peace in Ukraine and addressing the humanitarian plight of those affected by the conflict. Resolution L2 of the cross-regional group unfortunately does not address this. South Africa supports several aspects of the resolution. We support the immediate cessation of hostilities, reaffirming the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, as well as the establishment of humanitarian corridors. We support that civilians, humanitarian personnel, vulnerable persons, including women and children, are fully protected. We support the call on all states and parties to the conflict to fully respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We support the voluntary, safe, and unhindered passage of civilians, including foreign nationals, without discrimination. Mr. President, there are, however, elements of the resolution that make the attainment of a General Assembly consensus difficult. At this stage, it remains imperative that all parties to the conflict are committed to humanitarian principles and a UN humanitarian response and be part of an outcome that we adopt. It is for this reason that South Africa saw the need to put forward a text which focused specifically on the humanitarian plight of those affected. Political issues that may lead to member states not agreeing to a text should be addressed elsewhere. We believe that an impartial humanitarian resolution should focus purely on addressing the humanitarian needs of those affected. It is in this context that we proposed a text that will first and foremost focus on calling for the cessation of hostilities as the first step towards ameliorating the humanitarian situation. A crucial aspect of our resolution also calls on all parties to abide by international humanitarian law as well as all protocols of the Geneva Conventions. It remains pivotal that aside from addressing the humanitarian needs of the people, it must also lay the foundation for the parties to engage in constructive and meaningful dialogue. South Africa's approach has been that in the current context of the conflict in Ukraine, it is necessary for the United Nations to adopt a resolution on the humanitarian situation affecting the people of Ukraine that is based on the principles that govern humanitarian assistance, namely humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These principles provide the foundations for humanitarian action and are central to establishing and maintaining access to those affected. An important aspect of this resolution must be to express concern at the humanitarian situation and call on all parties to abide by international humanitarian law. Mr. President, South Africa has explained to Ukraine the rationale for introducing its own draft resolution. South Africa will abstain on the resolution L2. We have tabled a resolution, L3, which we believe is more conducive for a comprehensive humanitarian response. Regarding action we will take this morning, it is crucial that all voices be heard and given an equal chance. There should be no attempt to muzzle those we see as different from ours. That will be cutting at the core of what this United Nations is about and undermining its basic tenets and setting precedents we will regret for years to come. Therefore, following the action by the Assembly on L2 this morning, South Africa formally requests that the Assembly should vote on L3. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have heard the last speaker in explanation of votes before the voting. Before the Assembly takes a decision on draft resolutions A/ES11L2 and AES11/L3, I wish to address the question concerning the majority required for their adoption. In light of paragraph 2 and 3 of Article 18 of the Charter of the United Nations, if there is any objection to taking action on those draft resolutions by a 2/3 majority of the members present and voting, is there no objection? The 2/3 majority of members present and voting is therefore required for the adoption of the draft resolutions AES11L2 and AES11L3. As indicated by the President at the 7th plenary meeting yesterday morning, the Assembly will consider the 2 draft resolutions he has before it, taking into account Rule 91 of the Rules of Procedures of this General Assembly. Rule 91 states as follows: if 2 or more proposals relate to the same question, the General Assembly shall, unless it decides otherwise, vote on the proposal in the order which they have been submitted. The General Assembly may, after each vote on a proposal, decide whether to vote on the next proposal. Therefore, the Assembly will consider the draft proposal in the order in which they have been submitted. This means that the draft proposal that was submitted first, contained in the document A/ES11L2, will be considered first. The Assembly will now take action on the draft resolutions AES11L2 and AES11L3 one by one. We turn first to draft resolution AES11L2, entitled Humanitarian Consequences of the Aggression against Ukraine. For your information, the draft resolution has closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Thank you, Mr. President. I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to the delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become co-sponsors of A/ES11/L2: Afghanistan, Andorra, Argentina, Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Cambodia, Chile, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Grenada, Guyana, Haiti, Israel, Jamaica, Kiribati, Liberia, Myanmar, Niger, Papua New Guinea, Peru, the Republic of Moldova, Samoa, Singapore, Suriname, Switzerland, Timor-Leste, Togo, and Tuvalu. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor ES11/L2, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. Malawi, That's it. Thank you, Mr. President.
A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor? Please signify. Those against and the abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting. The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/ES11/L2, entitled The Humanitarian Consequences of the Aggression against Ukraine. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 140. Against, 5. Abstention, 38. Draft resolution AES11/L2 is adopted. Okay, the representative of South Africa has requested the Assembly should also take action on draft resolution A/ES11/L3. Ukraine, you have the floor.
Before I proceed with my statement, I need a clarification from the Secretariat. According to the Rule 91, the South Africa had to request the vote after the vote on the first resolution, and I want to know when did they request the vote?
Before we proceed, let's give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. South Africa requests that action be taken on the draft resolution, that voting be considered on a draft resolution. I thank you.
Ukraine, you have the floor.
That there was an attempt to confuse the General Assembly and not to follow the rules as they are. Therefore, before I make my proposal, I will explain why I will make procedural proposal. The state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, of course of actions, especially as relating to decisions and attitude change. That is how the General Assembly is already perceived by peoples of the world, and it is called cognitive dissonance. The text L3, a twin brother of the defunct Russian draft, you see the similarities. The text L3, a twin brother of the defunct Russian draft in the Security Council, where Russia got just one vote in its support, is a ticket to a public perception defeat for this assembly. If one thinks that the L3 draft is about Ukraine, they are totally wrong. This text has never been a product of consultations with Ukraine, neither it is a product of cross-regional consultations, as was the case with the resolution just adopted by overwhelming majority. It is a text promoted unilaterally by one country, prompted by another country, that has not even cared to hide it. No matter what the result of action in the Assembly will be, if there is an action on L3, it will certainly mean further undermining of its authority, if not loss of the remainder of it. If this isn't compelling enough for you, because maybe the authority and image of this Assembly isn't that important to you, then let me offer you another analogy. Imagine you have a child dying in your arms, and instead of administering to him the proper medicine that may be bitter and with many side effects, but it is the one that gives at least a chance of saving the child, instead of that, you opt for a placebo. Nameless, generic, inexpensive one handed over to you by a big supplier. Will you opt for it? Will you leave the dying child with no chance whatsoever? Just because this nameless, generic pill was so easy to get and to swallow. Think about it. That is exactly what document L3 is. It's a fresh paint on the mouldy, rotten structure of the Assembly, where the paint isn't actually paint, but the blood of Ukrainian children, women and defenders. Let's spare the Assembly from this shame. Let's prove that the Assembly is still a solid structure, and we are the United Nations that have been wise enough to avert imminent disaster. So pursuant to Rule 91 of the General Assembly's Rules of Procedure, we propose that the General Assembly decide not to vote on the resolution proposed by South Africa. We urge all delegations to vote against the proposal of South Africa to go ahead with the next draft. But before that, I will ask Mr. President to explain it very carefully to all of us what the vote yes and no means, so there is no confusion, because the entire design of what happens is to spread confusion in the Assembly. Thank you.
The representative of Ukraine has objected the proposal that the General Assembly should consider draft resolution A/ES11L3, taking into account Rule 91 of the Rule of Procedure. Before I put the vote in place, the voting means against means here not to consider draft resolution L3. On the voting that we're going to have now.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have two proposals. The representative of South Africa has proposed that since the General Assembly adopted draft resolution L2, that the Assembly should take action on draft resolution L3. That was what the representative of South Africa said, including in her explanation of vote that the Assembly should take action on draft resolution L3. The representative of Ukraine just has objected to the proposal that the Assembly should consider draft resolution L3. And so we have to go to a vote, and those who consider that the Assembly should take action on draft resolution L3 will vote yes, and those who consider that the Assembly should not proceed to take action on draft resolution L3, so put draft resolution L3 to the side, those should vote no. Thank you.
Thank you for the correction, Secretariat. I shall now put to record vote the question whether the Assembly should take action on draft resolution A/ES11/L3. We shall now begin the voting process. Oh. Okay, before we proceed, Australia, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. Judging by some of the chatter in the chamber, I just think it may be of assistance to delegates if the Secretariat again went through what the proposition is that is currently before the General Assembly and what voting yes would result in and what voting no would result in. This is a significant vote, and I just think it would be for the benefit of delegates just to hear again precisely what it is that we're voting on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me give the floor now to the Russian Federation.
President, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that you declared a vote, you announced a vote. The representative of the Secretariat explained to us what this vote meant. As we know, according to the rules and procedures of the General Assembly, nobody can interrupt a vote when it's been declared by the President.
Well, let's move with the voting. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of proposal that the General Assembly should take action on draft resolution A/ES11/L3, please signify. Those against and abstentions, please.
The General Assembly is now voting on the proposal that the Assembly should take action on draft resolution A/ES11/L3. Those who consider that the Assembly should take action on draft resolution A/ES11/L3 should vote yes. Those who consider that the Assembly should not proceed to take action on draft resolution A/ES11/L3 should vote no. Those who wish to abstain should press the button for abstention. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine. It's not adopted.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor 50, against 67, abstention 36. The proposal to take action on draft resolution A/ES11/L3 is not adopted. Since the proposal that the General Assembly should take action on draft resolution A/ES11/L3 is not adopted, the Assembly will take no action on that draft. Before giving the floor for explanations of votes after the voting, may I remind delegations that the explanation of votes are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I will now give the floor. I will now give the floor to the representative of India. India,
Thank
you have
you,
the floor.
Mr. President. India continues to remain deeply concerned at the ongoing situation which has rapidly been deteriorating since the beginning of the hostilities. The conflict has resulted in death of civilians, and nearly 10 million people have either been displaced internally or moved to neighboring countries. We have constantly called for cessation of hostilities. The humanitarian situation continues to worsen, particularly in the conflict zones in urban areas. Women, children, and elderly are disproportionately affected by the prolonging of this conflict. We reiterate our call for immediate ceasefire. There is an urgent need to address the humanitarian needs of the affected population. In this regard, we support the initiatives of the UN and its agencies. We hope the international community will continue to respond positively to the humanitarian needs of the people of Ukraine, including through extending generous support to the Secretary General's flash appeal and the Regional Refugee Response Plan on Ukraine. India has already sent over 90 tons of humanitarian supplies to Ukraine and its neighbors as a part of the 9 separate tranches of humanitarian assistance delivered thus far. These supplies have included medicines and other essential relief material. We are in the process of sending further supplies in the coming days. India has ensured the safe return of about 22,500 Indians from Ukraine. To that end, we initiated Operation Ganga involving 90 flights. We have also assisted nationals from 18 other countries in that process. We are deeply appreciative of the facilitation rendered by the authorities of Ukraine and its neighboring countries in ensuring their safe return. Allow me to underscore that it is important that humanitarian action is always guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, which is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should not be politicized. Mr. President, we firmly believe efforts at the United Nations should contribute to de-escalation of the conflict, facilitate immediate cessation of hostilities to promote dialogue and diplomacy, and bring together parties to find an immediate end to the suffering of the people. We continue to underline the need to respect the UN Charter, international law, and the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Mr. President, India abstained on the resolution since what we require now is to focus on cessation of hostilities and on urgent humanitarian assistance. The draft resolution did not fully reflect our expected focus on these challenges. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now give the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, sir. Tunisia voted for the draft resolution which was put before it today. This was because of the extreme importance Tunisia gives to the humanitarian situation and the need for all parties to respond to the imperatives of international humanitarian law. And it was also based on its constant care for life and to respect the right to life, to protection, and access to humanitarian assistance. All the more so because the suffering of innocent civilians is unsustainable. It is unacceptable to see the suffering of children, older people, and disabled people who are the first affected by the conflict and who have paid the heaviest price. The humanitarian situation, which is becoming increasingly grave, is a hallmark of conflicts around the world. And this is the case for the conflict in Ukraine as well. We pay tribute to the efforts of the United Nations and of humanitarian agencies. We reaffirm the importance of focusing efforts on putting a stop to the war so that the parties can reach a peaceful settlement and reestablish stability and security, whilst also putting an end to the deterioration of the humanitarian situation, to stop the flow of refugees and of displaced persons. We thank Ukraine's neighboring countries for their efforts to alleviate the suffering of Ukrainians and the Ukrainian people, as well as those living in Ukraine. The main reason for the creation of the United Nations was to save future generations from the scourge of war. 7 decades later, millions of people around the world continue to fall victim to death, siege, famine, and hunger. We call for an end to the deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. The international community should speak with a single voice when it comes to this humanitarian situation par excellence, which should not be a source of dissension. The international community should not remain silent when faced with the suffering of millions of refugees, displaced people, and besieged people in areas of conflict, not only in Europe but also in Africa and in the Middle East. To conclude, Mr. President, we call for heightened international action to encourage the parties to the conflict to reach a peaceful settlement. The consequences of this conflict go beyond the area itself and reach other regions of the world, particularly developing countries who are menaced with food and energy insecurity, whilst they continue to suffer the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to the representative of the Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Mr. President, the Lao PDA is gravely concerned about the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. My delegation commends all and supports all humanitarian efforts to assist the affected Ukrainian people and all foreign nationals. We applaud all countries and organizations which have extended swift humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. Likewise, we believe that all parties and organizations concerned will continue to ensure safety and provide secure passage for the refugees in and around the conflict zones. The top priority for now is to prevent the situation from further escalating, while salvaging every glimpse of hope for an immediate and even permanent cessation of hostilities. Mr. President, my delegation voted abstention on the resolution L2 entitled Humanitarian Consequences of the Aggression against Ukraine because we believe that the General Assembly's resolution with humanitarian objective should be adopted by consensus, and the text should contain well-balanced and non-politicized language that would help to ease the tension and create conditions conducive for all humanitarian operations on the ground, in line with the fundamental principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, reaffirmed by GA Resolution 46/182 and 58/114. The urgency now is to seek political and diplomatic solution to the conflict, and we commend all ongoing efforts and peace negotiations between the parties concerned. Therefore, there is a dire need to refrain from any actions that could fuel the escalation of tension and hamper diplomatic efforts. Only diplomatic means will lead to the ceasefire agreement and allow unhindered humanitarian actions. We have already witnessed the negative consequences derived, which could entail long-term impacts on innocent people in the region and the global community at large. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now we give the floor to the distinguished representative of Rwanda.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, Rwanda takes the floor to explain its position after the vote we just had. Mr. President, we voted in favor of this resolution to firmly reiterate the position we expressed in the previous sitting on the situation in Ukraine. Mr. President, the substantive focus should be injected in pressing for achieving three main objectives: protection of civilians, humanitarian support, and dialogue. In this regard, Rwanda would have loved to see unity of all member states around a humanitarian resolution in this General Assembly. It's unfortunate that we see divisions when the lives of innocent civilians are at stake. Mr. President, the current and the crisis do not guarantee that it will bring peace. Instead, it is generating human suffering. Therefore, Rwanda joins many other delegations in calling for the immediate cessation of hostilities, and we fully support international efforts to de-escalate the war and any mechanism that can bring peace. Diplomatic options present a better solution and sustainable peace. And in this regard, Rwanda calls for open dialogue and negotiations in good faith. A lasting solution will only be achieved through dialogue by both parties, considering the concerns of both sides. Mr. President, similarly, the parties to this conflict should not make civilians the shields against gunfire, as it amounts to violations of international law. Finally, Mr. President, Rwanda calls for a sincere commitment to protection of civilians. The ongoing crisis poses severe pain to innocent civilians who are now uncertain of their future. We encourage both concerned parties to give a chance to peace. We wish to reiterate that the long-lasting solution to this current crisis is primarily in the hands of the Russian Federation and Ukraine. They have the key and the padlock. They can unlock it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you to the representative of Rwanda. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Malaysia voted in favor of Resolution L2. We are deeply concerned with the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, which Malaysia has been monitoring closely the development in and around Ukraine, including what is happening on the ground. Malaysia strongly urges all concerned parties to take immediate steps to de-escalate, continue dialogue and negotiations to prevent further loss of lives and devastation. We call for safe and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance to those affected within and around Ukraine. We call for the respect for and protection of civilian life and infrastructure. Malaysia urges on all parties to fully comply with the obligation under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Mr. President, we also want to address what we witnessed today, whereby the Assembly had to look into two resolutions. On the two resolutions that were initially tabled before us, we saw similarities and merits in both texts. As such, if both were to be voted upon, we would have supported both texts by voting in favor. Malaysia is disappointed that the authors of both texts did not work together to reach an agreement on a single text. Malaysia strongly feels that it is important to have a focused and balanced resolution that addresses the dire humanitarian situation on the ground. The tabling of two resolutions on the same issue today, including the need to address a procedural motion, does not convey the idea that the United Nations, that the international community itself is united in expressing solidarity for those who are affected by the humanitarian crisis. This is unfortunate. It was also glaring to note that there were no open-ended discussions with member states at large. We felt that there should be more open-ended consultations conducted so that the authors are able to engage with the larger membership of the UN in order to gain their views on the matter, especially since there were 2 resolutions on the same issue. Mr. President, Malaysia reiterates the inviolability of the fundamental principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty of a country and peaceful settlement of disputes in the maintenance of international peace and security. We will continue to support international efforts to seek a peaceful and amicable solution to the conflict in the interest of maintaining regional and international peace and security, as well as promoting greater prosperity. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. You have the floor.
President, I won't today address the wars that were unleashed by those countries who today are asking for an end to military activity, presenting themselves as peacekeepers. This is the countries who for 8 years were silent about the crimes that were carried out by the Kievan regime on their own citizens in Donbass, and not only in Donbass, but across Ukraine. But I would like to turn to one date today. The 24th of March has been mentioned as the month for the beginning of the special military operation, but I'd like to address another date. Today is another anniversary. On the 24th of March 1999, the United States and their allies in NATO began their military aggression against the Republic of Yugoslavia, which continued for 78 days and nights. The alliance carried out more than 35,000 military flights, releasing some 3,000 cruise missiles throughout more than 10,000 tons of explosives, in a TNT equivalent that was more than 5 times the Hiroshima bomb that was launched over Hiroshima by the United States in 1945. As a result of the bombings, more than 2,000 Serbs died, including children, women, and older people. Later, they were cynically called collateral damage. Thousands of civilian objects and cities were destroyed. The autonomous area of Kosovo was also affected. The ejection of NATO in 1999 against Yugoslavia was the first military attack in Europe on a sovereign state since 1945. This was the tragic contribution to European history made by the so-called strictly defensive forces. I can also provide you with other examples today of people who have spoken in this hall. President, I think there's no point going into the details of why Russia has voted against this draft pseudo-humanitarian resolution presented by the Western allies and Ukraine, because it was put forward exclusively to once again condemn Russia and to apply different labels to us as a response to those who are ready to sign to the one-sided view of the situation. We are grateful to all of those who found the bravery to look at the truth in the face of what's happening. The pseudo-humanitarian draft, we can also call it that because our Western colleagues have harped on humanitarian issues, but didn't support the adoption yesterday in the Security Council of Russia's truly humanitarian draft resolution. However, the political considerations won over. The the humanitarians have, and the draft resolution doesn't compensate for what's actually happening on the ground. Furthermore, we also must note that there's an unprecedented pressure being applied by Western countries in the General Assembly, and therefore it's once again gone beyond its purview in trying to address questions of the maintenance of international peace and security and violating the UN Charter's relevant paragraph on this in going beyond its purview. This similar way of doing things, or obscription, adopted by an ultra-virus, is destructive, or is null and void, and doesn't create any consequences, legal consequences. We regret that, in addition, that because of this procedural squabbling that's taken place in the UN, which Western countries have set up to prevent a vote on the draft resolution presented by our colleagues from South Africa, there were so great the fears of our Western colleagues of dealing with a situation where their monopoly on the General Assembly on draft situations on the crisis in Ukraine, with an anti-Russian slant to them, would then be undermined. In working this way, the initiators of this argument have unmasked themselves. We thank colleagues from South Africa for their initiative and for their decisiveness, and also those countries who were ready to support their draft. We hope that the UN members will remember what was the lesson from our Western colleagues on the manipulation of humanitarian principles. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the representative of...
First of all, I would like, on behalf of Algerian mission, to express to the US government and to our colleagues, members of US mission, my deepest condolence and my sincere compassion following the sad loss of Her Excellency Mrs. Madeleine Albright, US Secretary of State, former US Secretary of State, who was very close to my country, Algeria, and with whom we had worked closely to reach peace agreement signed in Algiers in December 2000, which put an end to the war between brotherly countries, Ethiopia and Eritrea. Coming back to the explanation of Algerian vote, in Aljazair تعرب عن
Algeria expresses its deep concern over the deterioration of the crisis in Ukraine and its aftermath on the humanitarian situation, which has become a tragic reality that requires more than ever everyone to abide by the rules and principles of the international humanitarian law that define international obligations in this domain, especially the Geneva Conventions of 1949, the Additional Protocol of 1977, and the International Human Rights Law. In this regard, Algeria calls upon the Security Council to carry out its primary responsibilities for the maintenance of international peace and security and cooperate for world peace in accordance with the UN Charter. Algeria would like to reaffirm its attachment to the principles and purposes of the UN Charter and the rules of international law based on the respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of states, as well as the mutual respect of international obligations and international security assurances. Algeria also stresses the importance of intensifying diplomatic efforts to put an end to the current humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and reiterates its support of all efforts aimed at easing tensions through dialogue and negotiations as the only way to resolve this crisis, stop further bloodshed, and take care of the tragic humanitarian situation without discrimination in addressing human suffering. This would help achieve security, safety, and stability of the countries and peoples of the region.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Brazil.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, Brazil voted in favor of the resolution adopted here today because of the urgent need for the United Nations to send a strong message on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. The General Assembly could not become a bystander while the world witnesses the swift transformation of once peaceful cities into war zones, with shocking images from the conflict and the desperation of thousands of civilians trapped in the battlefield, with no food, no water, and no electricity. No, the dire situation on the ground demanded a swift reaction from us. However, we deeply regret that the General Assembly was not able to speak with one voice today, promoting compliance with international humanitarian law, protecting civilians, calling for peace. These are objectives that should unite rather than divide us. Brazil would have strongly preferred a consensual text, resulting from effective, transparent, and inclusive negotiations, rather than a fait accompli, a draft resolution that was not open to negotiation and whose language contained clearly divisive elements, many of which going beyond the humanitarian aspects of the conflict. We would have preferred a resolution with strictly humanitarian messages, calling for the immediate cessation of hostilities and respect for humanitarian law. Essentially, this was the moment for a constructive resolution, one that could influence the behavior of the parties on the ground, promote effective humanitarian arrangements, and create the so much needed space for negotiations to end hostilities. We have doubts whether this resolution adopted today will have this effect. The current text also fails to address a pressing concern arising from the ongoing crisis: the humanitarian consequences of indiscriminate economic sanctions, which will inevitably affect all countries, particularly the developing nations. It will not only put additional hardships on economies already recovering from the pandemic, but it will probably affect the most vulnerable populations. In an attempt to correct a wrong, these broad economic sanctions might, in the end, create more harm than they were intended to prevent. Mr. President, this is a watershed moment for the United Nations and for multilateralism in general. The gradual erosion of the rules prohibiting the use of force culminated in what is one of the greatest challenges to our collective security system since its inception. And we are now at the risk of further jeopardizing basic tenets, norms, and institutions that the international community built with enormous effort. We should not politicize humanitarian messages, and we should not selectively apply international humanitarian law, which was created precisely to safeguard a minimum of human dignity, despite how inexcusable the causes of a war might be. It is commonly said that war begins when diplomacy fails.
We are concerned that we might have missed an opportunity to use diplomacy to create bridges and facilitate effective humanitarian actions that could represent a first step towards peace. There can be no military solution to the conflict in Ukraine. At the General Assembly, it is our responsibility to maintain the paths of dialogue open and to effectively contribute to a lasting solution to this crisis. Mr. President, Brazil would also have voted in favor of the draft resolution proposed by South Africa, whom we thank for the efforts in synthesizing the most pressing issues on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. The text focused on humanitarian aspects as it should be, thus complementing the strong political messages conveyed by the resolution adopted in the special emergency session on March 2nd. The draft reaffirmed the commitment of the international community to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of all states, including Ukraine, within its internationally recognized borders. It called for an immediate cessation of hostilities, which is the most effective way to address the humanitarian situation in any armed conflict. It also demanded full respect for international humanitarian law by all parties, in line with the spirit that has guided the creation and development of the rules of war. It addressed issues of humanitarian assistance, which is urgently needed in Ukraine. Brazil fully subscribes to the messages conveyed in that draft resolution proposed by South Africa. Some might argue that it was competing with the resolution that the General Assembly has just adopted. Indeed, as I said previously, we would have preferred only one consensual text in front of us today, one that had been negotiated with the entire membership in a transparent and inclusive manner. However, both texts have important humanitarian messages. They did not contradict each other, and Brazil sincerely regrets that the General Assembly has declined to take action on a draft presented by a member state that took nothing away from the earlier draft and could have coalesced a greater number of members around the humanitarian needs of Ukraine. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Egypt.
Thank you, Mr. President. Egypt would like to stress the following points in line with the resolution that was just adopted on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Egypt has voted for the resolution proceeding from our belief in the international humanitarian law rules and the protection of civilians in armed conflicts. First, all parties must not politicize international humanitarian action or relevant resolutions. Egypt was not comfortable with the way some wanted to negotiate about such humanitarian resolutions which undermine our effort. We reiterate our rejection to the use of economic sanctions outside the international multilateral ruling system, since it has a huge impact and consequences on the hardship of civilians and the world economy, which is still recovering from the impact of the COVID. In this vein, Egypt would like to stress that the continuation of this conflict had its negative impact on the price of food and energy, as well as the influx of international trade. Thus, we have to give the appropriate priority to such matter on the international scale so that we can share the burden on the countries importing food. Egypt underlines the need for all parties to shoulder their relevant responsibilities and ensure access to humanitarian assistance to all affected and provide assistance also to the foreigners beyond the borders. We also stress that this search for a quick political solution to put an end to the crisis as soon as possible is necessary, while taking into consideration the concerns of all parties and addressing the root causes of this crisis. This should be at the forefront of the priorities of the entire international community, and in particular the United Nations. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Iraq.
Thank you, Mr. President. My country, Iraq, has suffered from wars over the past few decades. The Iraqi people know full well what it means to be in dire need of humanitarian aid at times of crises and wars. The United Nations, our partners and friends, have all provided us with all the necessary humanitarian support to overcome the repercussions of relevant crises. Accordingly, and out of our sense of responsibility towards the Ukrainian people, we have voted for Resolution A/ES-11/L2 that aims at providing and promoting humanitarian assistance to those in need in Ukraine. And we would have voted for the draft resolution A/ES-11/L3 tabled by South Africa if we had that chance. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now let's give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
President, the delegation of Sierra Leone adds its voice to the rest of the speakers before us to express our deepest sympathy and most sincere and heartfelt condolences to the government and people of the United States of America through the United States Mission to the United Nations on the passing away yesterday of former Secretary of State, Her Excellency Madeleine Albright, who happens to have been a great friend of Sierra Leone. I say so because in 1999, when the war was raging in my country, the then Secretary of State visited our country in support of peace and reconciliation to speak with our leaders. That act will never be forgotten. We are eternally grateful, and may her gentle soul rest in perfect peace. That said, Mr. President, the delegation of Sierra Leone has asked for the floor to explain its position on our vote on the resolution just adopted. In our explanation of vote after the vote on the resolution ES-11/2 of 2nd March 2022, Sierra Leone expressed grave concern over the regrettable serious situation created in Ukraine with ramifications for regional and international peace and security. We expressed grave concern over the growing refugee and humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine. We called for and reiterated our call for equal treatment for all those seeking safety and refuge, and that there must be meaningful action on this call for equal treatment with dignity for all those fleeing or directly affected by the conflict without discrimination, particularly on the basis of race or immigration status. Mr. President, Sierra Leone is gravely concerned about the dire humanitarian situation in Ukraine and therefore voted in favor of the resolution. Over our vote on resolution ES-11/2 of 2nd March 2022 was based on our fundamental belief in the sanctity of the United Nations Charter, its principles and purposes, and the principles and purposes of the United Nations. We proceeded to emphasize the need for consistency and good faith in application of the Charter principles and international law, and at the same time not absolving the actions and inactions of the United Nations, particularly in addressing peace and security questions in Africa. Similarly, Mr. President, on principle basis, we recognize that humanitarian resolutions are meant to enable the delivery of humanitarian assistance in accordance with the principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality. In this regard, we have been guided in our vote by the framework agreed by this General Assembly in Resolution 46/182 of 1991. We have accorded appropriate consideration to the principle to respect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national unity of states in accordance with the United Nations Charter and the need for humanitarian assistance to be provided with the consent of the affected states. Our vote this morning is therefore in the light of the accepted principles in the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by reiterating our call for the immediate cessation of hostilities and urge for the continuation of the ceasefire talks, setting the path for good faith diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the representative of Indonesia.
Mr. President, Indonesia expresses our deep condolences to the people and government of the United States on the passing of Secretary Madeleine Albright. May her soul rest in peace. We thank the delegation of Ukraine, France, and Mexico, together with the core group, as well as the delegation of South Africa, for their initiatives. Indonesia voted in favor for the resolution because of the need for action to address the dire humanitarian situation in Ukraine. However, Indonesia deeply regrets that the General Assembly was not able to speak with a strong and united voice, which is urgent and required at the moment, as it manifests our commitment to save lives. However, consensus has been increasingly difficult and a luxury in the General Assembly, even on a matter as important as the humanitarian issues. Indonesia deeply regrets that the world had to see today how divided we are. The United Nations is in a matter of such great importance. We were presented with 2 draft resolutions addressing identical issues. While this stems usually from the absence of political will, it is not the case on this issue. Indeed, we saw a strong political will from all members to address the humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine. However, we view that the lack or unwillingness to have inclusive consultation and dialogue amongst ourselves is at fault. Indonesia believes that it is imperative for all parties to always sit together and try to iron out differences and achieve delicate balance. Taking into consideration the importance of the issue at stake, we were ready to vote in favor for both resolutions because we believe that despite our differences, our ultimate objective must be to save people's lives. We regret today that we have seen unfolding of events to prevent all proposals to be considered equally. We hope moving forward we can do better to uphold the democratic spirit of the General Assembly. Mr. President, every day we continue to witness the worsening humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine. The impact is also now being felt by innocent civilians in many least developed and developing countries with the increasing price of basic food commodities. Should this continue to persist, we might have to deal with a humanitarian crisis that at a bigger scale. We therefore reiterate our call to stop the war. It is crucial to urgently de-escalate hostilities to allow access for humanitarian assistance. We also need to allow safe passage for civilians fleeing from Ukraine. But more importantly, we believe that it is urgent that we push for a perpetual peace. To this end, we need to focus on rebuilding trust instead of discord, so that the political settlement could yield positive outcome that pave the way for this way to stop this perilous war. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the representative of Eritrea.
All right. Thank you, Mr. President. Okay. Eritrea is taking the floor in explanation of position after the adoption of draft resolution A/ES-11/L2. The draft resolution just adopted regrettably makes reference to the resolution adopted on the 2nd March, which my delegation voted against. Eritrea is disappointed that the humanitarian issue is politicized. Eritrea rejects any politicization of humanitarian issue as it undermines action geared towards addressing core humanitarian situation of affected peoples and countries. Had the text presented for the consideration of the General Assembly focused on humanitarian priorities only, it could have been possible to adopt the text by consensus, garnering a much stronger and united voice on humanitarian principles that matter most within the context of the agenda item that we have been discussing for the last 2 days. Eritrea appreciates the initiative of South Africa, and Eritrea was prepared to support the L3 tabled by South Africa. In the consideration of humanitarian assistance, it is important that the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence is upheld, and all humanitarian actions are guided by the full respect of these principles. Despite the geopolitical differences between US-led NATO and Russia, which is having grave humanitarian consequences for Ukraine, Eritrea wishes to stress that all parties to the conflict take concrete steps to respect their obligation under international humanitarian principles to ensure that all civilians and nationalities, including African nationals, are fully respected and protected. It is important to make every effort possible to minimize humanitarian consequences for the civilian population. The unfolding humanitarian situation demands agreeing on a ceasefire and achieving humanitarian pause to ensure safe, rapid, voluntary, and unhindered evacuation of civilians. While the task of humanitarian assistance is ongoing, there should be an earnest effort on the political track to end the conflict, and in this regard, Eritrea wishes to reiterate its call for the peaceful resolution of the conflict through dialogue and diplomacy. Finally, on a more serious political note, the current campaign or drive to go back to a unipolar world order, I quote, tightening the noose on Russia, end of quote, is becoming more dangerous and risky military confrontation, which runs contrary to the fundamental pillars of robust multilateralism as well as the lofty aspirations of the majority of the world's people and nations. We must remain guided by the UN Charter in the full respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of states for a peaceful world order. In this tumultuous period of great uncertainty, Eritrea wishes peace to Ukraine and Russia, as well as to the rest of the region. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the representative of Thailand.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thailand joins previous speakers in expressing our deepest condolences to the government and the permanent mission of the U.S. On the sudden passing of the former Secretary of State, Madame Madeleine Albright. May her soul rest in eternal peace. Mr. President, Thailand voted in support of the resolution because of the overriding importance that we attach to the protection of civilians, including humanitarian personnel and persons in vulnerable situations. Our support of the resolution underlies our deep concerns for the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Ukraine We urge all parties to fully comply with international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and to protect civilians and civilian objects, as well as ensure unhindered provision of humanitarian assistance without discrimination and politicization. In this regard, we commend Ukraine's neighboring countries and other states which have quickly mobilized humanitarian assistance to those in need. On our part, Thailand reaffirms our responsibility to the collective global efforts to alleviate the plight of the affected civilians. We have provided humanitarian assistance, including food, medical, and other essential supplies, to the affected civilians through the Ukrainian Red Cross Society. The only way to reduce the humanitarian consequences of the crisis is the peaceful settlement of dispute. We continue to hope for progress in the bilateral dialogue between the concerned parties and all efforts of peaceful settlement of the situation. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you. Let me give the floor now to the permanent representative of Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Jordan has voted in favor of the draft resolution L2 out of our belief in the necessity of respecting international humanitarian law and the international law, as well as the UN Charter. Jordan calls upon all the parties to the conflict to a ceasefire and to engage in effective negotiations in order to restore peace and stability and to alleviate the humanitarian sufferings that have resulted from this crisis and to allow the return of the refugees. Jordan also calls upon the parties to respect their commitments in line with the international humanitarian law during armed conflicts, including not targeting the civilians and civilian infrastructure, and respecting the principle of precaution in order to save the civilians from the scourge of wars. Parties should also spare no effort to protect civilians and humanitarian workers and to allow the unhindered access of a humanitarian relief without any precondition, and to provide safe passages for the civilians to exit the cities and conflict regions. Jordan supports the diplomatic efforts that are being deployed and the role of the United Nations in reaching a political and peaceful and sustainable solution to the conflict. And in order to protect the legitimate interests of all parties and safeguard the territorial integrity, independence, and sovereignty of Ukraine. Although Jordan has voted in favor of the draft resolution L2, we would like to reiterate the importance of looking closely into any allegations of violations of the international humanitarian law, because the international responsibility should be upheld. And we have to know that this international liability is not predetermined, but is the result of an effective and documented violation of the provisions of the law of armed conflicts. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Mr. President, my delegation abstained from voting on the draft resolution L2. We reiterate our position on the current conflict as explained during the meeting of the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly held on 2nd March 2022. The Islamic Republic of Iran is deeply concerned about the deteriorating humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine. Iran reiterates its principled position regarding the need for peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law and underlines the necessity of full respect by all parties for the well-established provisions of the United Nations Charter, international law, including international humanitarian law. We emphasize that sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states must be fully respected, and the safety and security of all civilians and civilian infrastructures must be guaranteed. Iran reiterates its call for the urgent cessation of hostilities and the escalation of tensions in the current conflict and encourages all parties to pursue their concerns through dialogue. We support the ongoing negotiations between the parties and reiterate our call for an urgent, peaceful resolution of the conflict in accordance with international law. Mr. President, we believe that the resolution just adopted by the General Assembly contains certain elements that go beyond the scope of the humanitarian situation on the ground and lacks realistic mechanisms for dealing with the humanitarian aspects of the conflict. The Islamic Republic of Iran emphasizes that the humanitarian nature of assistance must always be upheld and that the provision of humanitarian assistance shall only be guided by the principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality. Iran urges all parties to cooperate in advancing humanitarian response to the situation, and in this regard emphasizes the need for the provision and effective delivery of humanitarian assistance to the people in need, including the refugees. We call for the immediate facilitation of safe, voluntary, and dignified transfer of all civilian refugees and IDPs from conflict-affected areas. Humanitarian issues have a prominent place in Iran's foreign policy. We once again express our readiness to cooperate, coordinate, and facilitate the provision of humanitarian assistance to the people in need in the current conflict. In this context, we commend the continued efforts by the Secretary General, the UN agencies to deliver humanitarian aid as well as assistance and protection for refugees. Finally, Mr. President, my delegation regrets that Member States were not given a chance to vote on the draft resolution L3 focused on humanitarian issues which are urgently needed now. Had the draft resolution L3 put to the vote, my delegation would have voted in favor of it. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the representative of Lebanon.
Mr. President, allow me to express our deepest condolences on the passing of Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Secretary Albright was a great leader, a trailblazer, most importantly, a role model for so many women in diplomacy and foreign policy, including me. I personally knew her as a great champion of freedom and democracy around the world, including in Lebanon. Mr. President, we just adopted a resolution on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Lebanon voted yes on this resolution. We wish a resolution on this important matter was adopted by consensus, and this General Assembly was united behind it. Colleagues, friends, now what? Where do we go from here? Is this resolution going to be implemented? Is it more important to score successes in voting than making real progress on the ground, helping the traumatized children and women who are looking for us to stop this war? How safer are the civilians in Ukraine because of the resolution today? How closer are we to a solution? How closer are we to peace today? Mr. President, we are failing in our duty to stop the scourge of war. We are failing the civilians in Ukraine. We are failing the world that's standing now at the abyss of a food crisis and the prospect of hunger and famine. This war is reverberating across the world, especially in least developed and vulnerable countries that have not yet recovered from the pandemic and the financial crisis. Mr. President, it's high time for an immediate cessation of hostilities. It's high time to alleviate the humanitarian plight of civilians, especially children and women, who continue to worsen by the day. It's high time to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems, as enshrined in Article 1, Para 3 of the Charter. In this regard, we reiterate our call for a peaceful solution of this conflict through diplomacy, dialogue, and negotiations. I want to echo what my sister Mato, the ambassador of South Africa, just said in her statement. War has no heroes. Real heroes are those who work towards peace. The failure to stop a war in Europe 76 years ago led to an estimated 70 to 85 million deaths in World War II. We have to do everything in our capacity to stop this war and make sure it does not devolve into a wider war. We in Lebanon know very well the price of war and the consequences of inaction on lives and livelihoods, not in one country, but around the world. I call on all my colleagues here to act as heroes for peace and to embark today, as we get out of this hole, on a new path towards a consensual resolution that unites us around peace. Mr. President, the General Assembly clapped today at the adoption of this resolution. I think the real celebration and triumph is when we vote for the stopping of this war and end the misery of the Ukrainian people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the representative of Lesotho.
Lesotho voted in favor of draft resolution L2. The yes vote has been motivated by deep desire for humanitarian action to immediately come into place, primarily for the people of Ukraine and other nationalities suffering as a result of the situation in their country. Fundamentally, therefore, the vote for Lesotho is focused on humanitarian action as opposed to causes of the conflict or any other factors that may escalate or fuel that lead to further suffering of these people. We do hope that passing of this resolution focus will be on humanitarian action. As in the last vote on 2nd of March, Lesotho's position was principled on respect of the UN Charter, respect for humanitarian law, respect for territorial integrity for nations. We pray that we see cessation of hostilities and a resolution of conflict by peaceful means and restoration of peace in that region. I thank you.
Thank you. We have heard the last speaker in the explanation of vote after the vote. Now we will hear statements after the adoption of the resolution. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France on behalf of the European Union and 27 countries.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, we have just adopted a resolution on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. This is a balanced text which faithfully reflects the disastrous situation on the ground. It recalls the importance of putting an end to the humanitarian catastrophe and to respect international humanitarian law. It calls on Russia to put an end to its aggression without delay. This text, which is the result of a broad consultation with Ukraine and the member states of all the regions, was co-sponsored by 80 countries. It was adopted by an overwhelming majority. This is a very strong signal that this General Assembly sends. The peoples of the world and the people of Ukraine need it. This is why the European Union supported Ukraine's procedural request. We must be more than ever united behind the principles of the Charter of the United Nations and humanitarian law. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Denmark on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries.
Mr. President, I deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, Sweden, and of course my own country, Denmark. Today we voted not to take action on the South African resolution titled The Humanitarian Situation in Ukraine. Let me be clear. In general, the South African resolution included messages and principles that we, as steadfast defenders of the humanitarian principles and international humanitarian law, are supportive of. Yet the decision to vote not to take action on the South African resolution was not difficult, for reasons already stated, but bears repeating. First, our problem with the text was less so what was in it, but what was not in it. It only mentioned Ukraine. Yet Russia alone bears responsibility for the humanitarian catastrophe we are discussing today. Only Russia can end it. The responsibility is clear, and the message we send from the General Assembly must be just as clear.
And second, our problem with the text was not who was behind it, but who was not behind it. As UN member states, we have a strong tradition for engaging on humanitarian crises together with the country of concern. And the sponsors of the South African resolution are among the strongest defenders of this principle. It was therefore particularly regrettable that the resolution was drafted without the engagement of Ukraine, and even more so that it was tabled in competition to the humanitarian resolution put forward by a cross-regional group of countries together with Ukraine, a resolution which was adopted by an overwhelming majority of this General Assembly. Mr. President, it does not take much imagination for any of us to put ourselves in the place of our Ukrainian colleagues. Your country is invaded, your people is living through a humanitarian disaster. How would you expect the UN to act? Would you expect and insist to be consulted? If the answer is yes, your conclusion can only be nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And as Nordic Baltic countries, we are grateful that this too was the message of the General Assembly today. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Israel ascribes great importance to allowing for the provision of unhindered humanitarian assistance. We are of the view that the utmost effort should be undertaken to avoid civilian casualties, especially vulnerable populations, including women, children, persons with disabilities, and the elderly. It is for these reasons that Israel voted in favor of Resolution L2, which should be read in accordance with the obligation of all sides under international law as applicable. Israel remains gravely concerned by the growing humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and is doing its utmost to provide aid to those in need. We have normative, historical, and ethical obligations to be part of the humanitarian efforts. In that regard, Israel has already provided over 100 tons of humanitarian assistance to the people of Ukraine, including medical supplies, generators, water purification systems, emergency water supply kits, and winter gear. Just yesterday, Israel inaugurated the Shining Star Field Hospital in western Ukraine. As the head of the Israeli delegation noted at the inauguration ceremony, Israel hopes to light the path of refugees in need of medical care. We will extend a helping hand to them, as has always been the state of Israel's custom in such humanitarian crises. Israel reiterates its call for de-escalation and for dialogue. In view of our positive relations with both parties, we are assisting in the mediation efforts to stop this tragic war. We hope and pray for a peaceful resolution of this crisis, rather than more needless suffering and bloodshed. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to the observer state of the Holy See.
Mr. President, the Holy See welcomes the adoption of the draft resolution, Humanitarian Consequences of the Aggression against Ukraine, by this 11th Emergency Special Session of the United Nations General Assembly. My delegation is pleased to see that the draft resolution, with such clarity, deplores the dire humanitarian consequences of the conflict, expresses grave concern at the deteriorating humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine, reaffirms the need to protect the safety, dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms without any kind of discrimination of people fleeing the conflict and violence, strongly condemns any attacks directed against civilians and civilian objects, and stresses the particular impact that armed conflict has on women, children, including as refugees and internally displaced persons, and other civilians who have specific needs, including persons with disabilities and older persons. Furthermore, my delegation welcomes that the resolution recognizes the manifold consequences of the conflict, including increased food insecurity globally, and the potential impacts of a possible accident resulting from bombing and shelling of the Ukrainian nuclear infrastructures. Addressing the pilgrim in St. Peter's Square yesterday morning, Pope Francis spoke in remembrance of the many victims of the conflict, recalling that there is no victory in war. Rather, everything is lost in war, which is nothing else than a self-destructive defeat of humanity. In the face of the death and suffering caused by the conflict, the Holy See reiterates its call for an immediate ceasefire, the establishment and respect for humanitarian corridors, and to advance a real and decisive focus on negotiations towards, in the words of the adopted text, the immediate peaceful resolution of the conflict. The gratitude of the Holy See is extended once more to all, from states to individuals, who have opened their homes and hearts to those fleeing the conflict, to all who provide food, clothing, and medicines to those in need, and to all who labor for putting an end to this conflict. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. We have heard the last speaker on this item. In accordance with the terms of paragraph 14 of the draft resolution A/ES11L2, which the Assembly has adopted, the 11th emergency special session of the General Assembly is temporarily adjourned.